Hi, I'm Academic Lead Developer at RackForms. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how we install RackForms Express. So the first thing to note about RackForms Express and indeed RackForms is that they are web form software packages. And what that essentially means is that we need a web server to run them. So in other words, they're not like executables that we place on our desktop and kind of double click. We actually have to have a server set up first. And so the easiest way to do that usually, and probably the most common, is that we'll already have a web hosting service already subscribed to. So for example, GoDaddy, Bluehost, HostGator, etc. That's not to say, however, that we can't run RackForms locally. And indeed we can. Two of the most common ways of doing that are to install something like XenServer CE, or if you're on a Mac, MAMP, and this actually provides a web server for you. Again, though, this is a little bit less common, so in this video we're going to focus on having a hosting provider such as GoDaddy that hosts websites for you. So let's get started then. So the first thing that we want to do, of course, if we haven't already, is to grab your copy of RackForms Express. If you haven't already, it's at rackforms.com/free web form builder. We just click this link right here and we'll get from that our express.zip file. To express.zip then, we're going to send it to our web server. Obviously, your web hosting platform, and I say that with somewhat of a smile, unfortunately, I should say, every web hosting platform is a little bit different, and that means their control panels are a little bit different. So obviously what you're seeing here is probably not going to match your system, but if I could break it down simply, there are two main areas that we care about. The first is the file manager, and the second is the database manager. All the other things in our control panel we can ignore, and so we'll start in this video with the file manager. In other words, we want to take our express.zip file and upload it to our web server. So to do that, in this case, I'm going to look under Tools, and I can see something called File Manager right here. Again, your name will probably be a little bit different, but it should be pretty close to this. So go ahead and click that to launch the File Manager. Now, to my File Manager then, I'm going to simply select Upload File, and I'll browse into my desktop where I have my express.zip file, and I'll click OK to upload it. Now, one really quick point here. Obviously, this is a zip file that we're uploading, and there's a very specific reason for that. We don't want to unzip the file and then try to upload it, as that would usually fail because there's so many files. Uploading a zip is the way we want to do it, because that way it goes quickly and it only is one file. Therefore, we don't have to worry about any files kind of not being uploaded during the upload process. Of course, because it is a zip file, then that means we need to unarchive it. So to do that, I'm simply going to select my express.zip file, and then I'll click, in this case, unarchive. Once again, your management tool might use something slightly different, such as unzip or deflate. I'm going to leave my default destination as /. That just means the root of the web server, because I usually like to run RackForms in that location, as I think it's a little bit easier to manage when you do so. So when it's done unzipping them, we're going to be left with a folder called Express. We could certainly rename this if we want to, but I usually like to leave it as Express. Now at this point, half of the job is done. We've already created our Express folder on our server. To double check that this is working, though, it's probably a good idea to go to your web server and to type in your domain and then /express. So that's what we'll do right here. So here is demo.rackforms.com, and I'll simply say Express. Now, a file called install.php should automatically load. If it doesn't, you'll just want to type that in manually, and it basically looks like this right here. Now again, as I said before, we're actually pretty close to being done. The one thing that we need to do, however, is to create a database user, and then a password for those. The good news here is most web hosting platforms make this process very simple, as you're about to see. Now, the way I like to do this is I actually usually like to open up, that is, create a database. I usually like to open up a notepad type application, and I like to create my username and password ahead of time so that I have it saved for the RackForms installer. So I'll go back to my hosting details, and I'll scroll around until I find my MySQL manager. In this case, I can see it's under databases, and I'll click to launch this application. Now again, your system probably a little bit different, but most of the time it's going to be something called MySQL or MySQL Wizard. The process that we want to do, however, is to create a database, a user, and a password. Now, as we're about to see right here, GoDaddy actually molds the database name and username together. That is, I don't create a separate database and user, I just create one. And so that's why right here I have ExpressDB as my user, and I'll just copy and paste that into that box. For the database password then, I'll simply copy and paste this value in right here. Now again, I do this very deliberately. If you can imagine, I've done a lot of installs of RackForms over the years, and this little trick right here of creating a little sheet where I can jot down my username and password is incredibly handy, because then I can just simply copy and paste my values. I don't have to worry about retyping them. Now the other quick point that I'll make before we leave here is that usually when we're creating database users and passwords, we'll have a lot of criteria that actually goes with this process. And as you can see here, this certainly has a lot of criteria. My password must be between 8 and 14 characters, start with a character, have upper and lowercase numbers, etc. Again, that's why I like to do this, is I will actually write out something and just kind of double check to say, okay, well, it's between 8 and 14 characters. Yep, it starts with the letter, sure enough. You know what I mean? I kind of do that little thing just to make absolutely sure that I've got the right criteria for it. Now, as I may have mentioned before, I did cheat here a little bit. In this older version of the GoDaddy software, it actually took a few minutes to create a database. So I actually did that before this video was started. I just went in and created my ExpressDB right here. Now there's one other thing I want to do before I leave this. This is optional in many cases, but just to be thorough, one thing that will happen to us sometimes is we'll need a database what's called host name. And so usually under most web hosting platforms, you'll have a way that you can look up more information about your database. And in this case, if I click Actions, I have this little option called Details. And again, this isn't always necessary, but I'm just going to skim over this right here and just see what each one of these fields are. So I can see here that my database name and username is both ExpressDB. So my RackForms installer, because my database name and username is both ExpressDB, that means that database name and database username will be ExpressDB. So I'll actually copy those in right now. Now we know what my database password is already, so I'll go ahead and copy and paste that in. But here's this database host thing here. So again, not always required. In fact, the newer versions of the GoDaddy hosting platform, this can actually be left as localhost. But in my particular case right here, for my host name, it's actually not localhost. It's this long value right here. So again, not always required, but I just like to skim through these values just to make sure I get everything right. And because I did so, I'm kind of rewarded with, aha, my host name is actually this, not localhost as the installer suggests. So I'll just go ahead and copy and paste that in. And that's essentially it then. We can ignore all the other fields. Database vendor, you can usually just leave that as default. Database port, socket path, just leave that all as standard. And then I'll just type in a username and password. So I'll say Matt and Test. I'll put in my email. And with that, I think we're pretty much ready to go. Once again, just as a quick reminder, database name and username, both ExpressDB. I copy and pasted my password in, so that should be right. I knew that my database host was this value by looking at the details. So again, in most cases, that'll just be localhost. And then I just typed in a username and password and my email. So let's get the install a shot right here. RackForms will work for a couple moments. If the install process works, you'll get the RackForms installation is complete along with this beautiful checkbox right here. And that means we should be good to go. Now it does ask us to delete the install.php file. We do this, of course, for security. We certainly don't want somebody else running the installer at some point. So to do that, I'll go back into my file manager. I'll click into my Express folder. Again, remember this is one that we unzipped. And to that install.php file, again, it says just delete the install.php file. Now, there's a bit of a fudge right here. We don't actually have to completely delete it. If I wanted to, I could just rename it to something like php.old. And then that way the web server won't actually serve this file, but I have the installer laying around if I ever need it, right? So you don't have to do that. You can just delete the file, but just a quick pro tip there that sometimes this is a little bit easier because, again, you can't go to this file as a web server or as a web browser, but it's there as a backup if we ever need it. But I digress. Now that we've deleted the file, let's just click here as it says. and I'll go ahead and type in that username and password I entered in that the right hand side of the screen. So again, this is not the database name here. This is that username and password from the right hand side. And sure enough, if everything worked out right here, I should get my editor interface. To make sure everything worked, I always like to do this right away first. So I'll click the little green button to preview the form. And again, if everything did work, we should get the form that builds and everything looks good. Now, real quickly before we leave here, I will mention that sometimes file permission issues can come up. Most decent web hosting platforms, GoDaddy included, won't ever have to make you worry about file permissions. They're just set up properly. Though if you do have a question about file permissions, we can always be reached at info@formboss.net, info@rackforms.com. That's the old address right there. Info@rackforms.com. And we can certainly guide you through those file permission issues. So, but generally speaking, again, most web hosting platforms will have that right straight out of the gate. So that's basically it. As a quick review then, essentially what we did is we went to rackforms.com. We downloaded our copy of RackForms. Out of that, we got a file called express.zip. We then went into our file manager of our program and we clicked Upload File. When the file was uploaded, because it was a zip file, we used the unarchive option of our file manager to expand it out. So we got all the files. We then focused on the database, essentially going in, and we kind of used a notepad right here to create a database username and password. And then because we checked this, we saw that our host name was slightly different. And then we went to the installer and we filled out all the values that were required. And when we clicked install, we finished up. So that's about it. Again, any questions though, please let me know. info@rackforms.com. And if not, happy form building, and we hope you enjoy RackForms Express.